Hello, South by. I'm Bret Kugelmass, founder and CEO of Last Energy. 6 years ago, I left Silicon Valley with the sole purpose of finding a keystone technology to combat climate change. And what I discovered was a black sheep, misunderstood, devalued, underappreciated for decades. Here at South by, ideas ascend, technology inspires, and inventions astonish. Where the stuff of science fiction becomes reality, research and development are celebrated, and a world of limitless possibilities meets creativity. But there's another side that reminds us of the trade-offs that we face. That for every innovation, we also pay a price. That every step it takes to create requires energy. Energy that contributes to carbon emissions. Carbon that builds year after year. There's a palpable tension between these two sides. The digital currencies we've created to revolutionize economic transactions use more energy than the entire continent of Australia. The electric vehicles we celebrate for transforming the automotive sector shift the source of their emissions from the user's gas tanks to their utility bills. And the computing power needed to train a single AI model produces 500,000 pounds of carbon. Energy is intrinsically linked to progress, but it is not without trade-offs. But what are we supposed to do? Not explore, not travel, not innovate, not try? I would never suggest that we limit our potential. I, like you, envision a future powered by progress. But what is the point of these great strides forward if the future they exist in is under constant threat? And how do we protect that future without limiting innovation? I will tell you for certain, it will not be through efficiency or conservation. If we accept a mindset of energy conservatism, it creates a different type of risk, risking our ability to deliver the types of breakthroughs that upend the status quo. Using less isn't the answer. Maybe you've seen this before, the countdown clock, reminding us how little time we have left to find that answer. Let us not forget that everything has a carbon footprint, solar panels, wind turbines, batteries as well. And they can only reduce our future footprint. They don't have the energy density necessary to remove legacy emissions. And remember, it is what we have already added that will still continue to add heat to our planet year after year. Since 1850, we have released 2.4 trillion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. In 2022, we released 37 billion tons more. And the renewables only offset 230 million. Okay, those were some big numbers. Here are some small ones. Those renewables avoided less than 1% of last year's carbon emissions. And that's only 1% of last year's problem, and 0% of the greenhouse gases that we've already emitted. Now let's say that those renewables, combined with every other solution we have today, got us to that net zero. That they wiped our carbon emissions in every sector: electricity, transportation, agriculture, industry, heat, I mean everything. Would the climate change outcome improve? Despite your intuition, your optimism? No, it would not. It does not change the impact yet to come from what we have already emitted. Furthermore, energy demand is expected to triple by 2050. So what is the answer? How can we reverse climate change if energy is in everything that we do, everything we touch, everything we try, if energy itself contributes to the problem? Energy dieting isn't the answer, since net zero won't even get us there. We need solutions that will help us pull trillions of tons of carbon from the air without adding more in the process. If we are going to tackle climate change, a problem 1,000 times harder than anything we've encountered before, we need a tool 1,000,000 times more powerful than the solutions heralded today. Now, what if I told you this tool already exists? That a single energy source could fuel any lifestyle without a climate cost? What if I told you that we have an energy so abundant that no one person, political party, or country would ever need to hoard it in unlimited currency for communities to secure their future prosperity? And what if I told you that we unlocked the potential of this energy more than 70 years ago? Nuclear. Infinitely abundant, carbon-free, always on, and unimaginably energy dense. These properties capable of not just meeting our global energy demands, but transcending them. Across the world, energy access directly corresponds to economic growth. And with nuclear, we could unlock economic prosperity for all, power innovation, and uplift standards of living across the world. All of this achievable without a climate cost. And this isn't some fairy tale, some far-off aspiration. We've actually seen it come true before. Today, South Korea is a global hub for industrialization and invention. But 60 years ago, they were emerging from devastation after years of colonization and war. Rebuilding their autonomy meant forging energy independence and security, where pipelines running across borders and geopolitical tension would pose no threat to energy access, would pose no threat to their sovereignty. By embracing nuclear as their energy foundation, they created the power to become an epicenter for investment, research and development, and industrial growth. Not only did they leverage nuclear power to meet their energy demands, they standardized their design, achieving affordable implementation. South Korea has become the gold standard for nuclear energy that powered their independence without a climate cost. So why haven't we seen more of these success stories? Why did a power source with so much potential stagnate at just 10% of global electricity? Well, we need to go back in time to answer that. In the 1960s and 70s, the United States built nuclear plants at the fastest rate we've ever seen. Nuclear was embraced by world leaders as the future of all energy. In 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy declared by the end of the decade, nuclear would account for more than half of the United States' total energy production, and urged the nation to become a global leader in developing this low-cost power source. Nuclear could have become the key to a future without trade-offs. We're living in their future today. We have the innovations they dreamed of: commercial space travel, artificial intelligence, autonomous transportation. But now we're facing the repercussions of this climate compromise. But why? Why did the cheapest, cleanest, most energy-dense source of power that we ever have simply stall in its tracks? Was it waste, safety, public perception? No, no, no. Despite the stories that we are told, it was the year before 3 Mile Island that nuclear development dried up, a result of systemic economic malfeasance, not public backlash. While South Korea was standardizing and productizing their plants, the United States nuclear industry marched down a path of over-engineering that ultimately led to its near-total collapse. We pursued ever larger, ever more complex, one-of-a-kind construction projects, raising nothing but prices. From 1968 to 1978, we saw a tenfold increase in the cost to build these gigawatt-scale plants. There is one critique that is totally justified. Nuclear is too expensive. Time and time again, we've seen attempts to reinvigorate the industry with these bespoke gigawatt-scale projects. But each of these attempts has failed, and all for the same reason. Nuclear is too expensive. And we've done nothing to fix this. The US is close to completing its first new nuclear plant in decades, but it is the largest and the most expensive ever. And it still isn't finished, despite running over schedule by 10 years and blowing its budget by $20 billion. In case I haven't made it clear, nuclear is too expensive. But it doesn't have to be that way. If we had continued to build out our nuclear capacity at the same rate we were building in the 1960s, we would be living in a very different world today. We would have abundant clean energy, no climate crisis, no countdown clock, no trade-offs when it comes to pursuing innovation or our everyday comforts. We have envisioned the future. We've looked to the past. But climate change is happening now. So how do we solve this today? Today, across the world, nuclear energy is powering countries and industries quietly and effectively. It works when the sun isn't shining and when the wind isn't blowing. It never wavers, it never ceases. There is nothing broken with the nuclear technology that we have today. What's broken is the business model, the delivery model, the way we sell it, the way we build it. But nuclear needs to scale isn't novel or particularly hard to understand. Korea figured it out. The oil and gas industry figured it out. The renewables industry figured it out. Productize, modularize, and mass manufacture. At Last Energy, we resist the urge to innovate and we focus on how to replicate. The key was taking what works and simply shrinking it down in size. This allowed for full modularization, total standardization, which in turn unlocked private development opportunities. We have took what took decades to build and cost billions into a scalable product that can be prefabricated and deployed in under 2 years, privately financed without the need for government subsidy. But it's not just about cost-effective design. This is our opportunity to create something accessible, create something transparent. It is an opportunity to create something beautiful, something to desire, something that people will love, that communities will embrace, a product to inspire. In just 2 years, we've gone from a design thesis to manufacturing here in Texas and selling dozens of plants throughout Europe, where the only thing more urgent than climate change is having enough energy to keep businesses running and homes heated through the winter. Over the next 2 years, our first set of plants will come online, marking the transition to a new future, one where we relish using more energy rather than obsess over efficiency. We cannot accept a future of conservatism, a future of climate trade-offs, where we artificially impose limits on human potential. I'll leave you with this thought. If we had a cure for cancer, would we not consider it inhumane to withhold access? So why then, in the context of energy, do we settle for the status quo when we've had the cure for climate change all along? I invite you to join me in a world where climate change is no longer a threat, but rather one where climate control has become a milestone of human ingenuity. A world in which every person has access to energy. A future in which humanity flourishes, where potential is unbounded, delivering what we dare to dream. Thank you. I would now like to invite Alexander Kaufman to join me on stage. Alexander is a senior reporter at the Huffington Post covering climate change, energy, and environmental policy, who has extensively covered the challenges and opportunities facing nuclear power across the globe.
Thanks a lot, Bret.
Yeah, great to have you here.
Let's give another hand for Bret.
Thank you.
So I really wanted to start, I think, when we first had a conversation about nuclear. I think we were both kind of struck by having had a similar entry point to this, and you touched on it in the speech, which is the question around carbon removal. So I just checked what the latest stat that I could find around estimates of what the cost of a per ton carbon removal will be with current direct air capture technology. It's about 1,200 kilowatts per metric ton that you're taking out. Tell me a little bit about, that technology and what role you see nuclear playing in it, and how the absence of nuclear in the debate around carbon removal has impacted how we are discussing that technology.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, yeah, I think we both came to discover nuclear from a very similar path. First, kind of from a first principles perspective, saying, I mean, come on, we have all these legacy emissions. This is what I was talking about in the speech. We have to draw these down from the atmosphere. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have net positive radiative forcing just from those emissions, even if we had nothing new. Okay, so that leads to the conclusion, well, we need direct air capture or some similar technology. But that's going to have a carbon footprint too, right? Everything has a carbon footprint. So the energy used to power direct air capture is going to have a carbon footprint. And so if you look through all the energy sources and say, okay, on a per kilowatt basis, how much carbon can you remove? The number has to be higher than what you emit, trying to draw that carbon down at the same time. Otherwise, there's just no way the equation works. And so you look through your list of energy technologies and you find something weird, this nuclear energy thing, which, by the way, 6 years ago I knew nothing about. But you find that it uses so many orders of magnitude less material that its inherent carbon footprint is beneath that threshold where it could actually draw down carbon. And that's what makes it just so special. I mean, listen, you are creating energy from breaking atomic bonds instead of chemical energy. That is 6 orders of magnitude more powerful. I talked about, we need a tool 1,000,000 times more powerful. That's what I'm talking about. It's that you can get so much from so little. That is the foundation to direct air capture. That is the only thing that's going to be able to reverse climate change. And it would have a lot of other advantages too. Like we wouldn't need to worry about decarbonizing every sector if we had this other tool to offset our emissions.
So can you take us back to that moment 6 years ago that you kind of had this epiphany? I mean, what was the light bulb moment for you that this was something significant that you wanted to, invest your time into?
Yeah, well, okay, it wasn't a light bulb is a problem. It took years and like hundreds of conversations. I mean, I started this Titans of Nuclear podcast, and that was my tool for exploring the sector, really trying to understand the challenges and opportunities. And so, light bulb, 2 years worth of little moments trying to get that light bulb to happen.
Oh, I guess that's appropriate then. You want 2 years worth of electricity to power that light bulb that we're talking about. But so explain for those here who haven't listened to the podcast, I mean, what the kind of journey was like with the podcast and how that then came to inform what you're doing with Blast Energy.
Yeah, so over the course of 2 years, hundreds of conversations, visited 15 different countries to see how they did nuclear, went to 50 different facilities, so everything from national labs to active nuclear power plants, both in our country and other countries as well. Interviewed every next-gen nuclear company in the sector, even did fusion interviews as well, and really just tried to understand, I was trying to develop a thesis, like, okay, if it's so obvious that nuclear is so great, why is it having so much trouble? One of the breakthrough moments was when I realized that because the nuclear industry is so closed off, a lot of it has to do with the early weapons development and just the fact that it's very secretive, and also because that, once again, back to this idea that you can do so much with so little, it's not that big an industry in terms of like head count for it delivering 10% of global electricity. And so what I realized was the incentives of the industry were set up. So you have the incumbents that do these giant, big government-to-government deals, and you have a bunch of science projects that are usually grant-funded, university-funded, and then eventually government-funded. And that's not a healthy industry. That is not an industry that allows startups and many ideas and many failures to come and attack the issue from every which way. And so that's why we had to, there are only so many shots you can have on goal as a startup in the sector. So we just had to be so process-driven, so resolute, and that's why we went through this such an extensive and drawn-out research process before we arrived on our solution, which was no science projects. Use only proven technology, attack the real issue. Okay, the issue is cost, right? I said that nuclear is too expensive, right? And where's most of the cost? In the interest accrued during your construction period. Not even the construction materials, okay? Literally the financing charges over a 10-year period at a high interest rate because of the risk associated with the projects accounts for 60% of your delivered cost of energy. So that was a light bulb moment when I realized that, and I said, okay, let's not reinvent the reactor. We're going to use standard off-the-shelf fuel, no new component innovation, and it's just all going to be about going, like, obsessively going after that constructability problem. And then that's when we went to the oil and gas industry and said, how do you guys do this? How do you do offshore platforms where you can't afford to have any delays of people out in the ocean? And they're like, oh, we just build the entire power plant in a factory first. Like, okay, well, that makes sense. And then who else is doing this? Okay, well, now pharmaceutical companies are doing this. Data centers are doing this. So what we're doing is we're just like the next in line of people to realize that there's a whole avenue of innovation related to constructability of heavy infrastructure rather than the core underlying technology.
So I want to get to how Last Energy's reactors and the strategy that you have compares to some of the other SMR companies that are in the field right now. But before we get to that, I was thinking about this last night, where I have a stack of books that I've been going through that have been written over the past 15 years about nuclear. And I found myself reading one that I wasn't sure when it was published, and as I was reading through the introduction, I was struck by how much I figured it had been written in the last 2 years. It was describing the exact same problems that we were having with climate change. It was describing the exact same realizations that climate policy makers and advocates were having about the limitations of renewables, whether that was intermittency or the mineral supply chains. And it was talking about the potential excitement for these things to do all kinds of things, not just to power, electrical grids, but to do district heating or industrial heating. And then I turned back to the front page and I looked at when it was published. It was published in like 2007.
Wow.
So, what is different now and what has changed since then to make this a moment that we might actually see a nuclear renaissance or a nuclear revival?
Yeah, and that renaissance is kind of a loaded word because of that exact history, right? We see this every now and then. Like every 10 or 15 years, the industry thinks it's going to have a renaissance, and then it falls flat. Yeah, I think, listen, there's definitely like global macro issues that have at least granted nuclear the opportunity to have another shot at a renaissance. Right? Because, why does it come back every 15 years? Well, a lot of things have to line up. And now energy security is just so pressing in Europe. It's all anyone talks about. It's life or death for them out there, okay? And so this has created a real opportunity for nuclear to have another chance. And I think what's different this time is we get to benefit from studying history. We get to see some of these failed attempts. And this modularization business, this is actually like quite fairly new. It started 20 years ago, but the technology has just been refining year over year. And so now I think it's really at the point where you have both the intersection of renewed interest in nuclear, a whole bunch of renewed enthusiasm, and capital markets are now coming in, and you have this new concept of manufacturing of physical assets. So I think this is a great opportunity.
So you shared the Vogtle news, or you were talking about Vogtle earlier. We obviously had the big news on Monday that they finally started splitting atoms at this plant that they began construction on in 2009. How significant of a step is that? And I guess going off that, can you give us a sense of what is an SMR? I know people in the industry who would say there are various different definitions of that term. So how do you define it, and how does that compare to the kinds of reactors that we're seeing potentially coming online this year in Georgia?
Yeah, and by the way, I will never ever disparage like the old big technology. I think it's amazing. I think we should have like so many more of these gigawatt scale plants too. If they could just get their constructability issues down, that would also be a perfect solution. And we should go at it from all of these different directions. And who knows, maybe there'll be some lessons learned and some pieces of modularity that can be brought over and translated, and some learnings from the big reactors and maybe shared supply chains. So yeah, I think it's great. It takes too long, obviously. This is not the only one. The Olkiluoto in Finland, Flamanville in France. These are also 20-year projects that are finally coming to fruition, and it's a good thing that they are. So your question about like what is an SMR? Well, yeah, everyone's got a different definition, right? I mean, the way that I think about categorizing the nuclear industry is across two different axes, technology and size. So you have new technology, sometimes they call it advanced reactors, but typically it always almost involves some fundamental change to the reactor physics, to the chemistry, to the material science. And the challenge that I've seen with that, well, by the way, all of those reactors will work, and there's no issue with them fundamentally, but it comes back to cost. If you deviate too much from the standard supply chain, you're going to see hidden costs crop up everywhere. If you need $1 billion R&D project to create a pump that moves molten salt for your perfect molten salt reactor, but now you have billions of dollars worth of pump costs, like that's a real challenge. And so, we attempted to avoid that by looking at that graph of, technology newness and size, and we found that niche where there was no one else operating, only proven technology, but at the small size.
So, I want to go back to the big reactors for a second. Yes, we see these examples of things that are billions of dollars over budget and, taking decades to build. The Sizewell project in the UK is another. But we also see things like the Baraka plant in the UAE.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what is different there and, what some countries outside the West have been doing around nuclear and, how that compares? And
Well, there's Korea again for you, right? They built 4 identical plants, delivered them on time and on budget. Yeah, they were $5 billion each, and that's still 5 times as expensive, inflation adjusted and everything, than our original fleet of reactors were in this country. So there's still some hangover in terms of these, big projects still being more expensive. They're not just theoretically that they should be, but then we actually have empirical demonstrated evidence, like our 1968 reactors, Point Beach 1 and 2. These are beautiful examples of how we should be building these gigawatt scale reactors. Now keep in mind, they were 500 megawatts, not a gigawatt, whereas the Baraka ones are a gigawatt each. Those were done for less than $1,000 a kilowatt, inflation adjusted. That is amazing. They were built, it says, I researched this, it says 3 years, but when you talk to people, it's like, okay, they still had 6 months. It was done in almost 2 years, they built those plants in Wisconsin. It's unbelievable. So yeah, we have that solution. I mean, someone could just literally go into those facilities and just scan everything and say, let's just build thousands of these across the world. I mean, we have the proof right there. So yeah, I advocate for that. I think what Korea is doing is a step kind of like that. They kind of almost got it. And we'd like to see a lot more people trying stuff like that too.
What do you feel like the kind of political imperative is around this? And I say that very much in the context of both what we're seeing in Europe as a result of the Russian war in Ukraine,
Yep.
And also with this increased competition between the United States and China.
Yep.
And obviously China is building more reactors than anyone else in the world right now.
I think something like 300
I know that they put out a 150 figure 2 years ago that everyone kind of raised their eyebrows at. But if you look at the World Nuclear Institute list of reactors, the 55 under construction, I counted them the other day, it was I think 21 or somewhere between 21 and 25 of them are in China.
Yep. Yeah, how do you guys feel about that? We probably shouldn't let China beat us. Right? We should probably be doing we invented this technology. We should be doing more than them, for sure. But yeah, the geopolitical issue, a lot's changed these last couple of years. Europe's been through oil crises before, right? That's not a new thing. And that's when France built out, 80%, but practically their entire country went nuclear. These geopolitical energy issues sometimes cement an impression that lasts that affects policy for a generation. So I think that we are going to see that out of Europe. And I know you've got a lot of interesting thoughts as to what has been culminating, leading up to these last couple of years. But it was before the war that we saw this crazy shift in perception around nuclear. Because when I talk to people, I think, first of all, most people don't even know what nuclear is. So nobody can say most people don't like nuclear, because most people, the average person, has no idea what it is, period. So it's not most people don't like it. But you did have a bunch of countries that had policies in place that reflected anti-nuclear sentiment. Okay, that's also true. But a lot changed about 2 years ago. As we've discussed before, I think it's like there was like a practicality. Like we use the term "the adults came to the room," right? I think it started happening, and all of a sudden, all of these countries that it was no longer on the agenda. I mean, even Sweden, even France said they weren't going to build more nuclear. 2 years ago, they all started changing their mind. Yeah, and then the war happens, pipelines get blown up, and people are like, "This is a no-brainer." And I don't know a politician out there today that wanted nuclear but was too afraid that it might have a political cost that hasn't outright just come and say, "Oh, we're doing nuclear and I'm proud of it."
I mean, it's an astounding thing. I found myself in Finland about a month after the war began last year, and I visited Olkiluoto Island, which is this tiny fleck of land off the southwest coast of Finland. Small, rural fishing community, not very, very beautiful place. And I was interested in going there at the time because they're building the first permanent disposal site for nuclear waste, which is an interesting thing that I think we can touch on later. But they were also about to open Olkiluoto 3, the first new reactor in Western Europe in 15 years, 25 years if you don't count the Czech Republic as part of Western Europe. So a very exciting thing. And about 2 weeks after I was there, they announced that they were going to join NATO. The Russians cut off the 10% of Finnish electricity supplies that were coming from Russian exports. And by the time that occurred, they were in pretty good shape. They were starting to start up the reactor, and they had some good backup to import from other countries. But this one tiny bit of land with these 3 reactors on it was able to power almost 40% of the entire country's electricity needs. The entire country's electricity needs.
Wow.
And then a month later, I found myself in the Netherlands, and I visited the only Dutch nuclear reactor that was ever fully commercialized in Borsela. That's right. And I was struck by the fact that on all sides, here was a country that was eager to build more nuclear, thought this was a great solution, has consistently thought this was a great solution throughout the 12 years that Mark Rutte has been prime minister, and yet hadn't been able to do it. And only now is talking about doing a serious expansion of its nuclear fleet while the Belgians are shutting down their reactors to the south and the Germans are doing it to the east. So in the countries that you're seeing that kind of a phase out, I mean, the Dutch were welcoming to it, at least under this administration. The Finns love it. Greenpeace in Finland likes nuclear.
Crazy.
And the Green Party in Finland advocates for nuclear. Very unusual if you understand the Green Party politics in most of Europe. So, do you see that changing fundamentally within European countries that have been anti-nuclear? And do you see Germany, given its heft and influence in the European Union, being a potential obstacle to other member states building new reactors?
They were an obstacle, for sure. Behind the scenes, the Germans are playing nasty tricks. But a lot of this comes down to politics. And it wasn't, I hate to criticize Germans because, well, first of all, they built great nuclear reactors. Their plants are some of the best, and they've built them around the world too. And obviously, you can't blame the people for the politics, but they did have this odd situation where to form coalitions. If you have these parliamentary systems, you need to form coalitions, and then all of a sudden, these minority groups have outsized influence on policy, and so that was what was going on in Germany, and politics change. So I think as those little minority political parties become less powerful, as the public sentiment shifts and it can no longer be a wedge issue, I do think Germany will change. I mean, the Germans are quite stubborn about stuff, but I think we've got real potential that at least they won't throw up roadblocks for other countries that want to pursue it.
So Last Energy is looking at Europe as the place that you want to launch first. I'm curious, which countries you're looking at and why there over the United States.
Yeah, the 3 countries that we've done deals in at this point are Romania, Poland, and the United Kingdom. A little bit of Eastern Europe, a little bit of Western Europe, I mean, across Europe, energy prices are ridiculous. Like you think, some months you might have high energy bills. You have not seen it was like during the Texas blackout, but like every week over there for years now at this point. They've got real energy issues. And so like part of our thinking as a new business is A, go to where the prices are highest, and B, go to where the demand is the greatest. Because as a startup, there are challenges coming at you from every which way. It's hard to go up against the incumbents. It's hard to go, to negotiate with governments and utilities and private customers. There's so much against you. You want to go to where it's easiest. So that was our calculus on what are our first go-to-markets. Go to where the prices are highest and the need is the greatest. In the US, we have a lot of different energy sources. We have a lot of different energy markets too, which makes it very confusing here. And the prices, quite frankly, aren't that high. And so maybe we'll come here someday, but boy, I mean, we could be selling like hundreds and hundreds of gigawatts throughout Europe before. And then, of course, there's the rest of the world, right? I mean, a big part of our mission as a company is energy access. So we got a lot of people we got to bring out of poverty too. And they're paying high energy prices. In Africa, the energy prices are higher than they are in the US. And then, Southeast Asia, is crazy about wanting to build more nuclear. They're just getting, ready and warmed up to do huge fleet rollouts at some point also. Latin America wants to build more nuclear. So, yeah, the U.S. is probably last on our list for a while, but we are an American company and we do build them here in Texas. So I'm very proud of that, but we deliver them to our foreign customers.
Do you see the attitudes of the U.S. government changing around nuclear exports? One thing that we touched on the China issue earlier and touched on Russia in the sense that Russian gas exports have been very well weaponized throughout the past 12 months. But do you see any potential obstacles to the U.S. actually becoming a major exporter again, especially when the competitor there is Russia, who has become the dominant player in exporting fuel, has become the dominant player in exporting nuclear to countries that are eager to build nuclear for the first time, whether that is the Egyptians, Turkey, or India. Where do you kind of see that playing into the attitudes of the U.S. government, and are you seeing more support from the federal government to do exports now that we see how difficult it is to rein in, Rosatom, the one energy company that we're not sanctioning since the war began?
Yeah, I mean, energy, I don't think it's going to surprise anyone in this room that energy is a geopolitical tool. Governments use energy as a tool to exert their influence on the rest of the world. That's going on. I think we can all acknowledge that. And we've done that in many ways before, and we're going to continue to do that. I mean, once again, I'm proud to be an American. I'd rather help our country achieve our geopolitical objectives. And if that means, using us as a tool to help us accomplish our mission abroad and to support our allies abroad, I'd love to be part of that.
So another thing I think we're seeing kind of between both an ally abroad and at home is some of this frustration this year over tritium releases. This is happening in Fukushima, where there's some tritiated water that has been cooling the Fukushima reactors. The Japanese government wants to release it into the Pacific this year. The same thing on a smaller scale is happening now in the U.S. Holtec International, which owns the decommissioning Pilgrim nuclear plant in Massachusetts, wants to do a similar thing on a smaller scale into Cape Cod Bay. Same company in New York with Indian Point wants to do that into the Hudson. What's up with this? Is this a dangerous thing? Is the public backlash that we're seeing against this justified?
This is an interesting one. I mean, and this can come into a whole diatribe I could deliver on, everything we've got wrong about waste and safety. And a lot of it comes down fundamentally to radioactivity itself. It's yes, you can have something that is toxic in certain quantities. There's no doubt. Radionuclides, they're toxic in certain quantities, and they can have adverse impact to biological health. But hazardous is something totally different, right? You need enough of something to make it hazardous. And these microscopic, minuscule amounts of tritium in the water, it is ridiculous to even be a concern. But I will also tell you, a lot of people make a lot of money keeping it in those tanks. I mean, I think and this is, by the way, where I get in trouble with the nuclear industry itself, because like 90% of the nuclear industry is in the business of selling you radiation protection services. And they've been doing so since the industry collapsed in 1978. That has been the nuclear industry's business, is actually scaring people about nuclear energy and then selling you the solution to fix it. So where does all this misinformation come? The nuclear industry. Who is making $200 billion cleaning up something that's not very radioactive at Fukushima? The nuclear industry is. And so, yeah, I don't blame anyone when they're like afraid of these like releases. I don't like what else are you to think if the experts are telling you that they have to spend like godless amounts of money keeping it safe? So yeah, I don't blame anyone, but it is kind of ridiculous to think that those levels of radiation could have any adverse impact on human health.
So do you feel that radiation is misunderstood? I mean, what are some comparisons that you think of for other types of radiation in our lives? Do you feel that we're overly sensitized to, these kinds of small amounts of radiation that we're getting from nuclear plants, or are we not paying enough attention to the bananas of the world?
Yeah, the bananas, that's always one of those things. Like, oh yeah, bananas are radioactive. The people used to illustrate, like, a lot of things have radiation in them. Do you guys know that, you're all radioactive? You guys know this? Like, how else are they going to do radiocarbon dating? When people talk about carbon dating, do you know how that works? It's because all living things are radioactive, and they're able to pick up on traces of that radiation hundreds of thousands of years into the future. So this idea that something else is radioactive and it might hurt us when we are already much more radioactive than people think, once again, yeah, people don't have a good conception, but you can't blame them. I cannot, people say, oh, we need to educate the public. Okay, we have so many things we want to educate the public about. We're going to train everyone to be a radiation scientist. It's never going to happen. But what we can do is stop selling them fear. And I think that's the best that we can hope for. In the meantime, the way that the nuclear industry is going to thrive is not going to be based on educating the public. It's going to be based on creating an economically valuable product and letting market incentives take over from there and disseminating it throughout the world.
It's provocative. Do you feel that the waste issue then is misunderstood? Because this is the thing that, I was in Taiwan a few months ago and talking to policymakers both in and out of President Tsai Ing-wen's government, and every single person who I asked, what are you doing? Why are you choosing to use less secure energy imports that could easily be blockaded by mainland China, should they choose to do so, and shutting down your nuclear reactors? And the answer across the board was waste, or other people are concerned about waste. Yeah. So are people wrong to be worried about nuclear waste? I mean, how much of it really is there in this country now? And is there a long-term solution to this? Or is it even a problem that requires the kind of solution that people seem to be grasping for when they're concerned about it?
I'll answer that in two ways, scientifically and socially. I'll start with socially because it's the easier one. Yes, people have every right to be concerned. If your 5 best friends tell you to be afraid of something, whether you should be or shouldn't be, you have the right to be concerned. Like, most of us just believe what people around us tell us without re-deriving everything from first principles. So I would never fault anyone from being afraid from something that everyone around them is telling them that. But scientifically, nuclear waste from power plants has never hurt a person, place, or thing ever. Ever. It's not that radioactive. People can go up to those casks and touch it. I think we've got some advocates here in the audience who have got some great pictures of having done that. The one radioisotope that has the properties that you would need to create hazard to human health, biological uptake, right? That's the iodine-131. That has a half-life of just 8 days. So yes, nuclear waste is radioactive for millions of years. So is a lot of stuff, like your granite countertop. The dangerous part is gone after 90 days. So that's my scientific answer for you.
So I want to touch on one more thing, and then I'd like to open it up to audience questions, if anyone has some. But I assume most people here, if you're in the room for a nuclear talk, probably heard the big news of a couple months ago now from Lawrence Livermore about nuclear fusion, that for the first time they were able to generate more energy through a fusion reaction than it took to spark the reaction in the first place. And this has been widely hailed as, meaning that nuclear fusion, the holy grail of energy, is finally going to come around the corner and won't be, as the joke goes, the energy source of tomorrow, and forever it will be. So how significant do you think that is? Do you think that the hype that we've seen in the wake of that is justified? And do you think that the journey for the nuclear industry will be from fission to fusion, or is that the wrong way to think about it?
I think it's totally backwards. I think to think that fusion is the end state instead of fission belies the facts on the ground. So if we care about an economical power source, one of the things that I keep going on and on about is you got to use the standard supply chain. The fusion companies could give me their magical box. I'll give it to them, whatever they think it costs, their magical fuel and their magical box for whatever the price. I can still show you how all of the envelope around that magical box still makes it the most expensive energy that mankind has ever seen, because it needs new material science, deviates from the standard supply chain, huge buildings, right? I mean, there are some approaches in fusion actually that I do think could be quite interesting. Anything that's like tabletop fusion, right, where you could make it a mass manufactured product. I think that is a great approach. And I also, by the way, think that we should be, if the government's going to put money in something, these fundamental R&D projects, I think are interesting, especially ITER. This is a money hole for fusion, but it also brings together scientists from around the world from 150 countries. That's worth it. Let's throw our money at things where the world comes together and brings scientists together and forges these relationships, and who knows, maybe they'll be the diplomats of the future. So I'm in favor of fundamental scientific research. But if we want a sober energy plan moving forward, if we want to scale up to achieve all of our dreams, let's invest in fission, starting with the proven technology, build up your supply chain, make hundreds and thousands of those plants, and then maybe that company I'll let do some R&D and get a little fancy with their technology at that point.
All right, well, look, I could keep going for easily another hour, but I know that this room is filled with people smarter and with even sharper questions than me. So please, we have a microphone over here, so if you come up and speak into that.
How long would it take you when you get an order, to ramp up and produce that nuclear reactor for a customer?
So right now, start to finish, from when you order the basic equipment to when it can be delivered, we're targeting under 24 months. But our whole business model innovation is to start acting much more like the airplane companies or the car companies, where you have an assembly line and you have inventory and you are just ramping up to make as many as you can. And then when an order comes in, you've got one on the shelf ready to go. So it might take a few years to get there, okay? But that's what we're working towards.
So my understanding is these things are modular and they're smaller.
Yep.
Significantly smaller.
Significantly smaller. They also produce less power, okay? So I'm not saying that you get everything. But someday we'll have modular and small and also produce more power. And that'll be some of the innovations to come.
All right, so you could have one for a college campus. You could have one for another kind of a industrial customer or something like that. And,
that's a perfect way to think about it. A college campus uses almost exactly the same amount of energy. Let's say a college campus with 20,000 students would use just about the exact same amount of energy that one of our plants provides.
Okay, all right. Transportation, airplanes?
Throw them on the back of a truck. Our kit comes in 75 shipping containers and bolts together on site. And that bolting together on site and commissioning takes about 3 months once they're delivered.
Capital markets, you mentioned they're coming in. You getting a lot of money?
Well, not wanting to tread on any SEC violations, I can't tell you exactly how much money we're bringing in. But yeah, the financial markets they've been eager to find a clean energy technology that doesn't yield them 6% returns for a while. They're having a tough time I mean, I think we heard it at Sarah Week last week. Next Era CEO was like, wind is a garbage business for them now. Like, yeah, so they're like, these energy investors are looking for clean technology because that's part of their mandate, a lot of them, and having a lot of trouble with renewables making the economics work.
Well, this is the last question is, those things don't work, okay? They sound good, good sound bites, and particularly young people, they think this is a great answer. It's not.
But if you go really young people, I think they're starting to become huge nuclear advocates. Sometimes there's like a generational thing.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Good thing. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I got a follow up.
Okay.
So levelized cost of energy has led us to believe that wind and solar are the cheapest forms of energy. But to this gentleman's point, you see grids with high levels of wind and solar penetration have higher electricity prices. So the question is, we need to rethink how we ascribe value to generating assets. What's the right metric or the right systems model that the world should use?
Oh, God. Well, you're the finance guy, not me. But so I don't know what model, but I do know that we have oftentimes, and I think it's because sometimes things become sexy in the media, and so they look for whatever metric they can latch on to in order to tell the story they want to tell. Sorry to insult your brethren, but you're one of the good guys. Sometimes they confuse price and cost. I think that's the biggest one. And so you can see a low price, but there actually be a high cost. And then the question is like, who is there high cost to? Well, there could be high cost to your end consumer of the power because of all the things you need to do to add to the system level costs to make it work, including sometimes burning more gas, right? And so there's there's an extra, there's hidden carbon cost. There's actual monetary additional cost. The analogy, I'm still working on this one, so forgive me if it's not perfect, then I'll solicit suggestions. But the way that I like to think about cost and price is like a rabid dog you can get from the pound for very low price, but it'll have a high cost to you, and that's how I think of renewables.
All right.
Awesome. Thanks for the presentation. Had two questions. The OpEx of nuclear is the largest cost right now, right? It's like 90% of the cost of operating and fuel's a small percentage. What will your plant do differently? What's the the plan to make operations cheaper potentially? Yep. And I also want to hear a little bit more about your facility in Houston and what you're hoping to accomplish with that.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about OpEx. The high OpEx cost in nuclear is artificially imposed. They have 800 people working in a plant doing absolutely nothing. The plant runs itself. And by the way, most power plants today run themselves. And a lot of them literally run themselves. They have like a Siemens T3000 system. It's totally autonomously run. Technicians show up like every now and then, but there's like no one at them. That is a modern power facility. So if you just had nuclear have the ability to follow the same paradigm as these other heavy industry facilities and have no people there, which by the way, like no people is a good thing, right? So a lot of people make mistakes. People add additional, infrastructure costs for having to house them there too. So the more autonomous, the better. And ours are fully autonomous systems that have remote technician teams that can come by, and we have N+1 reliability on all our components. So you can just, without even taking the plant down, you can hot swap out anything.
So it looks like you're not rolling anything out in the United States. Does this have anything to do with the NRC? I know there was another company who was recently approved, but I heard that it also cost $1 billion to get through that. And if you could maybe talk about the regulatory landscape in these other countries that you're launching.
Yeah. Without being too critical of our competitors, approved is a very loose term. You can get a certificate, which means the regulator says, hey, I like your technology. That's not a license. So on top of the $1 billion they've spent, they might have $1 billion more to go to get an operating license, a permit to actually run their own facility. So there's a lot of regulatory hurdles ahead of them. The NRC, unfortunately, when it was set up in 1975, was set up as a single mandate organization. They're not allowed to consider cost-benefit analysis, which is wild. Every other industry is allowed to do that. The FAA, the FDA, right? The FDA is a dual mandate organization. They're obviously supposed to provide for public safety, but they're also supposed to allow for commercialization because you know what? Commercialization allows for public safety. Like what if we couldn't have penicillin because some people are allergic and might even die from penicillin, but if we were to withhold that from everybody else, like that wouldn't be a proper cost-benefit trade-off. So the FDA is allowed to consider this. The NRC is legally not allowed to consider this. And so they've had real trouble institutionally getting out of their own way to license these facilities. And I say that with also saying many of the people there are great. Like the actual regulators, like the people, the scientists that work there, good people. But the institution has a real challenge, and that's why they've never licensed a reactor from start to finish in their entire 48-year operating history.
Just a follow-up question. I'm from Japan. I used to work at the senior nuclear regulator at the time of Fukushima. I handle everything, okay?
Wow.
So one of my questions is also same as her, okay? After you mentioned, right, regulatory process, of course, they have an affection about the cost reduction, right? Then now analysis now working to create a 10 CFR 53. What's your expectation?
Well, and I may have missed part of that, but what's my expectation in terms of nuclear development in Japan?
Yeah, to others, so new systems.
New systems.
Yeah, they now discuss about the 10 CFR 53.
Part 53. So the Part 53 is the new regulation proposed in the U.S., but it doesn't solve the institutional challenges here. Unfortunately, in their attempts to try to streamline regulation, they've just added more pages, more requirements, and so it hasn't been going well.
I see your sketch there has this in a field, but can you talk about water consumption and disposal and how that works with these more modular systems?
Yeah, so the modularity has nothing to do with our water consumption, which happens to be negligible, less than 8 gallons per minute, I believe, which is like a garden hose. What we did was we made a very deliberate choice. We accepted worse thermodynamic efficiency on our power plant than a traditional power plant would in order to use air cooling for our tertiary loop. So while the reactor still pumps water through it, it's a water-based reactor, that heat is then transferred through a series of closed loops to the final one, which is like a radiator, almost like your car would. And so in the same way that you can blow air over your car radiator, but the fluid still stays in your car, the same is with our system. So we don't have a water consumption aspect to our power plant.
That's cool, very cool. On the security side, I like the idea of a basically staffless operation, but what is the risk? I mean, if somebody blows up a wind turbine, it's not going to hurt anybody. What if somebody,
Someone blows up a nuclear plant, it's not going to hurt anybody.
What's that?
Someone blows up a nuclear plant, it's not going to hurt anybody.
It's not.
Well, with Fukushima 1, 2, and 3, gigawatt scale plants. So that's 150 times as much power as one of our facilities and 150 times as much radioactive material. And the tsunami and the earthquake took out every single safety system, led to 3 core meltdowns, and not a single person was hurt. This idea that a meltdown leads to human hazard is totally baseless.
Okay, and then the last piece I want to ask about is the sourcing and then the spent fuel and how we deal with the disposal and that being on site or nearby, or where do we put all that?
Yeah. So you were the one who visited the Netherlands. Did you get to check out their waste?
So Cover was closed. I visited Borsela. Unfortunately, they were doing some renovations on the floor.
Yeah, I think the way the Dutch do it is the best because, remember, nuclear waste is actually not that dangerous. It's not even that radioactive, and the one radionuclide that you really care about, iodine-131, isn't there. It's all gone after 90 days. And so what do the Dutch do? They put it in a museum. They literally put their nuclear waste in a museum, and they allow people to go walk by and see artwork on one side and nuclear waste on the other, and that makes them not afraid of it anymore. The problem that we have with nuclear waste is the perception challenge. It's not a technical one.
So we can take one more question, just because we're running over. So please.
Thanks, Brett. Great presentation. My question is really assuming you get the approval to build. How are you thinking about running into the transmission bottleneck? So, 1,300 gigawatts of renewable energy already waiting for connection, and the 10-year timeframe for transmission build to connect those assets. And then a related question really to that is, with the modularized design, do you think you can co-locate with the demand? And how are you thinking, I guess, about microgrids and social licensing to co-locate with the demand?
Yeah, so, oh my God, it's perfect because you answered your first question almost with your second question, which is awesome. Yeah, that's exactly how we thought about it too. And you must be in the industry because that's like a very nuanced take to understand that these transmission constraints can cause real issues in terms of deployment of new energy sources. And so that was part of our thinking in the sizing, like what is the right size? We knew we wanted to go small. We knew we wanted every piece to fit on the back of a truck. But by going down to this 20 megawatt size, it turned out to be perfect for being distributed baseload. So not only are we able to co-locate supply with demand and not have to use the transmission network, but if we strategically place our assets where the transmission grid is weak, we can actually reduce the total load on the transmission network and free it up for other energy sources too.
Awesome. Thank you so much for listening. If
Yeah,
you aren't
thank you,
subscribed already, you should really subscribe to Titans of Nuclear. It's a wonderful podcast.
Thank you.